Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you back to this afternoon's session. I hope you had a productive break. I understand the informal discussions were quite rich discussions and lasted the full hour, so that's a good sign of the level of engagement in this workshop. This afternoon, we will continue with two presentations on risk communication, specifically on translating risk assessment and risk management into communication messages. We will then move on to the last session of the workshop. Sorry, I had a technical issue there. We'll move on to the last section of the workshop, which will focus on case studies on various aspects of risk analysis. Through these case studies, speakers will share their practical experiences undertaking risk assessment, risk management, and/or risk assessment or risk communication on SPS issues. I would now ask Ms. Anastasia Alvizu and Ms. Laura Whitlock, who will be our last speakers in the session dedicated to translating risk assessment and risk management into communication messages, to turn on their cameras. And I'll ask them to keep them on if possible until we finish up the Q&A session. For those of you who did not have a chance to listen to Ms. Alvizu's intervention on risk assessment yesterday, she's the Deputy Head of Unit D1 at the European Commission Directorate General, Health, Food and Safety. Before that, she was dealing with Regulation EC number 178 of 2002 on general food law in the Food Information and Composition Food Waste Unit of DG Sante. Ms. Alvizu will present on recent developments of the EU legal framework on risk communication. You have the floor, Ms. Alvizu.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I hope you can hear me well. I'm delighted to be with all of you and also to present to you the recent developments we have in the European Union as regards risk communication. As you will see, it's a work in progress. So yeah, let's see it closely. May we move to the first slide? Exactly, thank you. First of all, it's important to note how risk communication is defined in the EU legal framework. We have a definition in our foundation, in our in our overarching and legal instruments covering the entire food chain, the so-called general food law. And there, risk communication being recognized as the third component of the risk analysis principle is defined as the interactive exchange of information throughout the risk analysis process as regards hazards, risk-related factors and risk perceptions amongst all interested parties, that is risk assessors, risk managers, academia, food feed business operators, and other interested consumers and other interested parties. It includes, but it is not limited, it goes beyond the explanation of risk assessment findings and of the risk management decisions. Now, if I have to say it in a nutshell, risk communication bridges the gaps between science, amongst science, decision-making process, and the public, and ensures also the acceptability of the science, but also the acceptability of the risk management decisions. An effective risk communication is important for two main reasons, amongst others. It avoids, or at least tries to explain, any apparent divergences, real or perceived divergences, which may have an adverse impact on public perception. And this is as in relation to safety aspects. But it also guarantees a more comprehensive and continuous process throughout the risk analysis principle by involving all interested parties. So it's also very dynamic. It's this emphasis on the interactive exchange of information. Now, this is particularly relevant in the EU context, where we have 27 member states, where we have a centralized risk assessment body, the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, but we also have national risk assessors, and we also have, apart from EU risk managers at centralized level, we also have national risk managers. So it's a patchwork of different it's a combination of different actors. And it's very important to ensure consistency and to avoid divergences or incoherence. We do have divergences. They're rare, but we do have. We have divergences in scientific findings, and we also have divergences in risk management decisions. These divergences could be real, but it could also be perceived as divergences in the sense that very often they can be explained. They can be explained because of different methodologies. They can be explained because of different mandates. Let's assume a risk assessment may be based on maybe hazard analysis, while other risk assessment could be actually risk-based analysis. So it could also be for different. They could also be explained, the risk management decision, divergences in risk management decisions, because of different legal frameworks, in the sense that a product is destined for different uses. So this is that's why it's particularly important in every jurisdiction, but especially in the EU context because of the multitude of the different actors. Now, consumer trust, it's particularly important for consumer trust. Trust is extremely volatile. It takes years to build it, and it takes a second to lose it. And consumers very often are driven by their perceptions, risk perceptions, rather than facts. This is something we need to take into account. And this volatility of consumer trust is something that risk assessors and risk managers, when they communicate on risks, need to take it into account. The more volatile consumer trust is, the more negative is the impact on risk assessors' work, risk managers' work, but also on the competitiveness of the industry. That's the relevance for the businesses. This is key to have it in mind. Now, EU citizens struggle occasionally to understand the interplay between the different EU, but also national agencies, risk assessors, or international risk assessment bodies dealing with risk assessment of substances. They also struggle occasionally to understand different risk management decisions taken at EU level or at national level. And what is important, where there seems to be a lack, is understanding trade-offs in risk management decisions. This was apparent. This was one of the main findings we had in 2018 when the European Commission carried out an evaluation of the legal framework, which showed exactly this, that risk communication in the EU is not always effective, and we need to address it. It's not always effective in light of certain challenges. What are these challenges? Is the varied and increasing number of sources of information available to the public, the emergence, the increasing use and influence of social media on decisions taken by on consumer decisions, on citizens' decisions, the rising level of affluence and education of consumers, but also the increasingly complex character of new technologies and scientific methods. So that led us in the European Union to take action. Let's see what was the result of this. Next slide, please. We have a new regulation addressing exactly the transparency of the EU risk assessment and tackling also risk communication. It was adopted in 2019 and it was entered into application last March. For the very first time, we have specific provisions on risk communication. The new law recognized that risk communication cannot take place in silos. It has to be continuous. It has to be interactive, as it was the definition of risk communication. And accordingly, the new regulation sets out general objectives, general principles, and also empowers the Commission to adopt a general plan of risk communication, as we see in a moment. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, for the first time, we have definition of general objectives of risk communication. We need to, I have here the list, I'll go through it briefly, to raise awareness and understanding, especially in cases of divergences. And this needs to cover the entire risk analysis process. It is important to have consistency, transparency, clarity when we formulate risk management decisions, and those decisions must have a sound basis in order to ensure the understanding behind behind those decisions. The overall effectiveness and efficiency must be improved. We should also foster public understanding of the risk analysis, but here the focus is more on the respective tasks and responsibilities of risk assessors and risk managers. What the science aims to deliver and what the risk managers aim to deliver. This is very important in order to understand the outcomes. And in this process, the appropriate involvement of all interested parties and ensuring the appropriate and transparent exchange of information are also recognized as a general objective. Risk prevention strategies. This is also another aspect that we need to ensure, and last but not least, to make a contribution to the fight against the dissemination of false information. Next slide, please. We also have general principles. To some extent, they reflect also the objectives we saw before, but here they are more tailor-made also to the respective roles of risk assessors and risk managers. So apart from ensuring that accurate and all appropriate information is exchanged in an interactive and timely manner with all interested parties, and provide, of course, transparent information at each stage of the risk analysis process. And this is very important. It goes already back at the very beginning, at the framing of a mandate, until the very end, how decisions were reached, which factors were considered, what were the trade-offs, and explain those, and how the appropriate level of protection was chosen and set. And in this process, risk perceptions have to be taken into account. I mentioned it earlier that consumers are driven by risk perceptions more than facts. There are emotional choices, and that is something we must not neglect. Facilitate understanding and dialogue, and be clear and accessible to everybody, even to those that, especially to those that are not directly involved in the process or do not have a scientific background. It's important to be accessible. Next slide, please. Now, based on those objectives and those criteria, the European Commission is empowered in the coming years to adopt a general plan on risk communication. And this will be a legal instrument which would identify the key factors to be taken into account when considering risk communication activities. it will also consider the types and levels of risk communication activities and the appropriate tools and channels. As I said, we also need to make sure that risk assessors and risk managers are coordinated and they cooperate closely. So this appropriate mechanism need to be established. We have heard from civil society or from consumer associations that they're often confused because of the time gap between the publication of risk assessment and the decision of the risk management decision. There is a time gap and they don't know how to approach this. So we need to ensure coordinated messages and explain to the public what is the message communicated to them about and what to expect later on. And of course, the open dialogue where it ensures this interactive exchange amongst interested parties, we need to be framed, we need to be established. And that's what we will be looking at in the next few years. To do that, we have asked the European Food Safety Authority, a risk assessment body at the EU level, to help us out. Next slide, please. In this preparatory work, as I said, we asked technical assistance to EFSA, and they have provided the European Commission with 4 very interesting reports, which we still analyze. A very interesting report, the first one, and I have put here also the links for everybody who is interested to find out more, tackles exactly the issue of risk communication and the factors to be considered, certain recommendation and approaches how to develop this general plan on risk communication. We also have a mapping of the different coordination cooperation mechanisms on food and feed safety in the EU. We have complicated systems, so it's very important to know what exists in each member state and how these will interact at the EU level and a centralized level. There is also a catalog of communication tools and dissemination guidelines. Communication is an integral part of risk communication, so we need to address, especially in this in the world that we live today, all the electronic tools at our disposal, social media as well, and see what is out there that we need to rely upon in order to ensure an effective and efficient risk communication. And finally, we have an engagement toolkit, methods, tips, and best practices, especially with a focus to participatory processes. So this is, in a nutshell, the recent developments in the EU. So we are very excited to address this aspect of risk communication in a more concrete way, and hopefully we'll have positive results in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, for that presentation. I will now like to give the floor to Ms. Laura Whitlock, who is the communication lead in the Outbreak Response and Prevention Branch of the Division of Foodborne, Waterborne, and Environmental Diseases in the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. Ms. Whitlock leads the strategy and development of real-time risk communication messages for consumers and other stakeholders during outbreak events. Ms. Whitlock will present on multi-state foodborne outbreaks using real-time data to communicate real-time risk. Laura, you have the floor.
Great, thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. And in my case, good morning from Atlanta, Georgia. Like Gregory said, my name is Laura Whitlock, and I'm the communication lead in the US CDC's Outbreak Response and Prevention Branch. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes about how we make decisions at CDC on when to release information about ongoing foodborne outbreak risks to the public. So the most common reason we would decide to release information to the public about an ongoing outbreak is the source of the outbreak has been identified, the public can take an action to prevent illness. So for example, we've identified a brand of contaminated frozen chicken products linked to illness, and the public can check their freezers at home, throw the product away, and prevent illness. But there are other less common reasons that we would communicate. Sometimes a state or a local health department may feel like they need to go ahead and say something about an outbreak they're investigating, and it may result in questions for us about any other states that are involved. Sometimes we see a particular group at higher risk, so maybe we're seeing a lot of school-aged children or people in institutions affected in an outbreak, and that's concerning to us, and we want to get a message out to those folks. Sometimes we may be seeing more severe outcomes than we would expect, so a higher hospitalization rate or more deaths than we would like to see in an outbreak of a certain pathogen. Sometimes misinformation just begins to circulate, unfortunately, whether it be about the potential source or the number of states or number of infections. And it might be best in these situations that CDC goes ahead and says something about an outbreak investigation publicly, even in the absence of a specific source or a food item being identified. So when there's an ongoing foodborne outbreak that we're investigating, we at CDC continuously ask ourselves several questions. And that kind of helps us aid in the decision-making process about when to release information. So some of these questions are things like, is the outbreak ongoing? Is there a clear action step for people to take? What's the product shelf life? Do we know if it's a frozen product, could it be around for a really long time? Or is it something like a leafy green, a lettuce that's gonna be out of its shelf life in a week? Where's the product sold? Is it something that's sold nationwide? Is it sold internationally? Is it sold just in a region of the United States? Is a vulnerable group at higher risk? Are illnesses more severe than we would expect? Are we seeing some type of antibiotic resistance? And kind of what is the evidence that we have linking illness to the food? What's the strength of the data that we have? So when we're discussing the need for a public warning, we assemble as a group. And so that's a group of epidemiologists, laboratorians, communicators like myself, to assess the data that we have currently available in front of us. As we know with outbreaks, we never know what we don't know, and we don't have a crystal ball. So we kind of have to work with the data that we have in front of us, and it's always incomplete. We never know everything that we want to know. But we use the data that we have at the current moment to determine two things: the level of our public health concern and the specificity of that concern. And I'll discuss these a bit more on the next slide. Using these two primary concerns, we select the most appropriate communication scenario and communication tool to meet our communication goal. I'll discuss both the considerations and the scenarios and tools in the next couple of slides. I want to say it's worth noting here that the process of making this decision is very iterative, and we're assessing our communication needs continuously from the start of an investigation to even when we close the investigation out and when will we kind of issue the final communication about an outbreak. It's always part of our conversation when we're looking at the latest data in an outbreak. So I mentioned that we look at two primary considerations when trying to understand what communication scenario we find ourselves in during an active outbreak. The first we call level of public health concern, and we have two categories, lower and higher. Some examples of lower public health concern, you notice I'd say lower, not low. It's never low public health concern because it's an outbreak. People are getting sick, of course. So we say lower, meaning maybe we're seeing a low incidence of severe health outcomes, a typical or maybe a slow outbreak trajectory. So we're not seeing a huge bolus of illnesses coming in every day, no antibiotic resistance. So those will be considerations of lower public health concern. Some examples of higher public health concern would be things like higher than expected number of severe health outcomes, outbreak velocity is increasing rapidly, and we're kind of worried about how many illnesses we're seeing, coming in every day. And maybe we're seeing a vulnerable group more affected, like I mentioned earlier. The second consideration is the specificity of our public health concern. So this is kind of where our epidemiologic and traceback and laboratory data come into play. And we have three categories here. We have low specificity, medium specificity, and high specificity. So for some examples of low specificity of our public health concern, that would be things like we have absolutely no hypothesis about what the food item is linked to illness. We have no matching, food or environmental isolates. So we really just don't have any idea really what's happening. We know there's an outbreak, we know people are getting sick, but we don't have any idea of what's causing it. Examples of medium specificity would be things like we've identified a generic food item or maybe food category. So something like ground beef, but we don't know the brand or anything about the place where it was produced. Maybe we've identified a restaurant or grocery store chain, but we don't have any idea about what the food item was that was served there or sold there. Examples of high specificity would be things like we have specific details like lot numbers, best by dates, a brand, or we've got matching food or environmental isolates and some type of epidemiologic or trace back link back to that food isolate or environmental isolate. So you can kind of see that as we move through an investigation, we're hoping to get to high specificity as our data comes in and we now analyze it. But often we find ourselves kind of in that low and medium specificity as the data is coming in. I will point out that in addition to these two primary considerations, of course, there are other factors that we have to consider. This is real life after all. And we think about things like what data are we expecting in the next couple of days? Are we expecting some lab testing to come back? Is a state, going to interview a bunch of people today and maybe we'll have a lot more epidemiologic data tomorrow, things like that. So we obviously consider those things as well when we're deciding kind of what communication scenario we're finding ourselves in. So this is just a table that shows kind of the 6 different scenarios that we've developed at CDC and kind of the level of public health concern, the level of specificity of that concern, and what our communication approach could be in those scenarios. And I'd like to point out here that you can kind of see in the right-hand side that we sometimes give 2 options for an approach. And this is just to give ourselves some flexibility. Every outbreak is different. I've been doing this since 2012 and I have not yet encountered the same outbreak twice. And so I would say this gives us kind of an ability to tailor our approach. These scenarios are just simply a guide that we created to give us somewhat of a consistent framework when we're making these communication decisions in order to make it defensible and say, we analyze our data the same way in every outbreak, even if that data looks different each time. And so now I'll talk a little bit about what our communication approaches are and what tools we have. So you'll notice that I had low, medium, and high on that communication scenarios table. So for low at CDC, what that means to us is we don't have an idea of what's causing it. We're not super concerned about the trajectory of the outbreak or the illnesses that we're seeing. We're seeing kind of what we would expect, but we don't have any advice to provide people. We might just prepare a reactive statement, a holding statement that we could use in case we got any questions from a news reporter or from the public. And we would keep investigating, keep collecting data and analyzing it. If we're in a medium communication scenario approach, maybe we have either a low or a higher public health concern, but maybe not great information about what's causing it. That was kind of that ground beef example I gave, or maybe we just know it seems like it's ground beef, but we don't know the production facility or anything about, lot numbers or best by dates. What we would do in this scenario is we would often post something called an investigation notice, and I'll talk about what that is on the next slide. And we might do some general food safety promotion messages on social media, cook your ground beef, use a food thermometer, things like that, and then keep investigating, like I said. If we're in a high communication scenario and need a communication approach in this group, we would post something called a food safety alert. We would do proactive outreach to reporters. So we would send information about the outbreak to reporters, hoping that they cover it and get the word out to their viewers, and also do some social media. So I mentioned we have 2 kind of communication messaging templates that we use to release information. This is what we use on our website. It's kind of our main tool in our toolbox. A food safety alert, we use that when we have great specific advice to provide to consumers and retailers. Don't eat this brand and these products, these lot numbers. It's often associated when we have product recalls. So I would say when we have an outbreak and a recall results, we're going to use the food safety alert. And kind of as the name implies, alert, we're trying to say, hey, listen, there's something we want you to do here. This isn't just an outbreak where we're investigating. We don't know what's it is linked to. We're really wanting to get the word out. We use that word alert here. And you might see us use wording like, this outbreak of infections is linked to this brand of food. Do not eat it and do not sell this food. So it's a pretty cut and dry scenario. The investigation notice gives us a little bit more flexibility. You'll see we use the word notice and not the word alert. This is when we use this often when we don't have an item to alert the public to, but we still want to get information out. We still want to be transparent. We still have a communication need. We may know a generic food category. So if it's ground beef, we could say we're investigating this outbreak. It's linked to ground beef, but we don't know the source yet. We're still working on that. But in the meantime, if you have ground beef, handle it carefully, wash your hands, use a food thermometer, cook it to the appropriate temperature. So we still have something we can say. Sometimes we use this when an outbreak is very fast moving. Maybe we've seen this, we've had E. coli outbreaks in the past that have really just ramped up quickly. We're seeing lots of illnesses at once, and we're really concerned. We want to get the word out to people about what E. coli looks like, what the symptoms are. Also to providers to be looking out for people with E. coli and testing them and sending those isolates in so that we can do the DNA fingerprinting. We've also used them in outbreaks in which regulatory action isn't possible, or when we just want to remind people of general food safety practices, like I mentioned. So finally, I'll end my remarks. This is just a screenshot of a current outbreak we have open on our website now. It's actually hyperlinked the image, so hopefully if the slides get sent around, folks will be able to have that link. But otherwise, you can just go to the CDC website, and on the actual homepage, there's some links to some current outbreaks that we have open. But this is a Listeria outbreak linked to fully cooked chicken products. I'll just say that we've been using the web to issue alerts about foodborne outbreaks for more than 10 years now. And we've tweaked our template over the years, and we actually just recently updated them at the end of last year after we did some focus groups with consumers and got some really good feedback about what people want to see and what information they want to know about. These alerts and notices receive a lot of web traffic. We get several million page views annually every year. I would say most of our traffic comes from social media links and embedded links within news stories. I know we can always do more, but I think we're happy to see those shares and news stories spreading the word to more people about these outbreak risks. So that's all I have for you, but happy to take any questions, and thanks for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that presentation. So before we go to the next session, I would I'll go to the Q&A box and pass on some questions we've received. And the first one we received was talking about balancing risk communication versus confidentiality issues that may come up. So I know, Anastasia, you replied that you would answer this orally, but I think it's a question for both of you if you'd like to tackle, but maybe Anastasia, I'll turn to you first.
Yes, and I hope I clarified in my reply. I wanted to talk about the EU legal framework and how we see the link. It's very important in the regulations I mentioned before, where we bolster risk communication. We did also something else. We strengthened transparency of the EU risk assessment. In what respect? All studies, scientific studies that are submitted in order to have authorizations for regulated products will be made public, with the exception of confidentiality data. So everything except confidential data, duly justified confidential data. And these are will be put on a public consultation open to everybody, in order precisely for EFSA, European Food Safety Authority in the EU, to collect any other evidence, any other study that is out there and is needed for the risk assessments. So there is a link in the sense that we communicate, of course, on data that are not confidential. However, if the risk assessment, the scientific findings, point out in the conclusions that there are risks for public health, then previously classified confidential information needs to be released. So in a way, there is a link. In principle, duly justified confidential data are not communicated. However, whenever there is a public health risk or a risk to the environment, then they are released. And it's important to be transparent in that respect. And based on this intervention, I want to tackle another question that I saw. It's about, it was also addressed to me about the identification and assessment of pesticide hazards that are based on toxicological studies. Again, any studies submitted for approval or authorizations of plant protection products will be made public precisely to see, to collect and be subject to public consultations to pick up also public perceptions. And on the basis of the collected evidence, scientific evidence, EFSA will be issuing its scientific opinion. But this public consultation will be very important also for risk managers to understand societal concerns and to see where we need to put emphasis and how we can explain better any trade-offs that we need to take, or the basis for any risk management decisions. And I'll stop there and I'll pass the floor back to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Laura, I'll turn to you if you want to talk about the relationship between risk communication and confidentiality in your context, if you.
Sure. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with something called the Freedom of Information Act in the United States. This is something that all federal agencies are privy to. We have to abide by it. And basically, anybody can request pretty much anything from the CDC. The only thing that we can't give out is information about, people's names, where they live, things like that. But we often don't receive that information at the federal level. That's something our state and local health department partners keep. And so we're pretty much able to say whatever we want to say or whatever we need to say, or if we're asked. I think the one thing that does constrain us a little bit is with working with our federal regulatory partners at the FDA and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Obviously, we can't reveal any commercial confidential relationships between companies when we're, and that often does tie our hands sometimes when we're trying to issue advice to consumers to be very transparent about the supply chain and where that product may have been sold and the very intricate relationships between businesses. I have found myself getting very creative about how to craft a message that is both actionable and clear for consumers. And obviously not breaking the law by, shedding light on any commercial confidential relationships. But I would say that's really the only time it comes into play within our work. Otherwise, we're pretty free to say what we need to say. And our agency as a whole has given our group a lot of freedom to kind of be very transparent about what we're working on and when it comes to needing to put a risk message out there.
Excellent. Thank you. Perhaps, Laura, I'll ask you one more question from the chat before turning back to Anastasia. And the question was, or it says, the public generally does not believe the results of risk assessment conducted by government agencies, or there's some hesitancy. Apart from making the assessment reports public and open, what can we do as governments to specifically improve risk communication on these types of assessments? An easy one for you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think with the landscape of COVID-19, we're even under more pressure from government agencies about being transparent. And I think one good thing that has come from COVID-19, and then I'll talk a little bit more, is that I think that people are starting to understand we don't always know everything at once, and science changes. And I think that has definitely tested the trust that consumers have in government agencies. I think CDC does a pretty good job, and we actually have a pretty high rating among consumers in the United States as far as trustworthiness goes. I'm afraid to see those studies done again after COVID, but I think I would say that I'm hoping that it has shed some light on the fact that these are very much fluid situations or ongoing. We wish we knew everything, but I think for me, it's been a good lesson to see that our messages may change, and that's okay. We're still worthy of trust. And I think by just continuously putting messages out there, people seeing them, share them on social media, saying, thank you, CDC. I think to me, those are validating that people are still consuming the messages. They're still trusting us. And to me, it's kind of like the long game. We just continue being transparent and open. And the more we do that, the more people see that we are an agency that can be trusted, that our information is good, and they should take action on it, and that we have their best interests at heart.
Thank you very much, Laura. So before we turn to the next section, I think we have one more question we can ask for Anastasia, and I'll try to read it off here or summarize it. This participant said you spoke about quote unquote all interested parties in the appropriate channels, and one of the main motors of the public narrative also causing strengthening perceptions are the media. And the question is, do you agree, and have you developed cooperation with media, specialized media such as food media, science magazines, investigative journalists, to help I guess, spread your risk communication messages more broadly?
Yes. I would put more emphasis on the public debates and more public consultations. So that we have already launched. I mentioned it before, and I think public consultations early on in the risk assessment process on all studies that are submitted. I think it already generates, first of all, it's very open, it's very transparent. Everybody can comment like, okay, I see this, I'm not sure about the methodology or concerns, or there is another study out there that points into a different direction. But that also promotes this interactive exchange of information. Everything is happening in broad daylight and not behind closed doors. I think that's the first thing. Media, and have cooperations with media, we will see as part of the tools, but I wouldn't go that far at this stage to say we will have specific cooperations with specialized media. I think it's very important to be very clear and transparent about our message. I fully agree with Laura. We need to communicate that science is evolving. And so I think another comment that it's very important to know when the latest information comes that it supersedes the previous one. And this is also what we felt in the EU. We may have a risk assessment, let's say opinion in January, and a decision 1 year later, perhaps, or a few months later, let's say in September. And in the meantime, the public may be in a limbo. What the science pointed at that, how come and the risk managers chose something else? So it's very important to be able to communicate in a continuous manner what consumer or civil society should expect at each point in the process, even after a decision is made, because there are also a monitoring mechanism. It's not that, you know, something is authorized and then nobody's checking it. So it requires, it's very intense, and it has to be continuous, if I may say so.
Great. Thank you for that. I would now like to wrap this section up, but there are a number of questions still in the chat that we didn't get to, and I'm just cognizant of the time. So I don't know if Laura and Anastasia, if you do have time to stick around and maybe even reply in writing in the chat, in the Q&A, if that's possible. Otherwise, we'll try to find a different avenue to move on. I do want to thank you for your presentations and responding to the questions. Very, very informative. I would now like to turn to the last section of the workshop, where we hear from speakers about practical examples of experiences with risk analysis through case study presentations. Some of the presentations will focus on aspects of risk analysis, while others will explore various components of risk analysis and how they are interlinked. May I ask Dr. Alan McLeod, Ms. Amy Philpott, Ms. Yi Zhu Wang, Dr. Fukan Wang, Ms. Lillian DeLuna, and Ms. Barbara Gilani to turn on their cameras until the end of this session. I will first like to invite Dr. Alan McLeod to present on pest risk analysis, tools, resources, and key challenges. Dr. McLeod is a pest risk analyst in the Plant and Animal Health Directorate within the United Kingdom's Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Dr. McLeod has extensive experience in assessing plant health risks at the national and regional level and has coordinated British and European research projects investigating processes to enhance pest risk analysis. Dr. McLeod, with that, over to you.
Thank you very much, Greg, for that introduction. So yeah, I've been asked to talk about pest risk analysis. So this is phytosanitary risk analysis. Next slide, please. So typically, a pest risk analysis in the phytosanitary arena would take this sort of form. Starting on the top left, there'll be an initiation step. This is where we identify the pest, the hazard, as it were, the organism causing the threat to our plant resources. The reason for the PRA should be recorded. It might be an outbreak or an interception of an organism at the border, for example, and the PRA area will be identified. Typically, that will be a country, a national plant protection organization, or it could be a collection of countries, a regional plant protection organization, of which there are 10 around the world. Moving to the right of the diagram into the risk assessment phase, there could be a categorization step, which isn't shown on the diagram, but in the risk assessment phase, there'll be an evidence gathering step. For plant pests, you're wanting to know what the host plants are, what the plants that could be attacked by the harmful organisms are. You want to know where the organisms are distributed around the world, what countries are they in. You gather information on the biology of the organism and other types of evidence as well. Then, having gathered the information and evidence, you then interpret it. And this is often the most challenging step of risk assessment. You need to make a judgment as to whether its organism can be introduced, that is, can enter and establish in the PRA area. Then what are the mechanisms for spread? And what would be the consequences? What are the potential impacts that could result as a consequence of the organism becoming introduced into the PRA area? These elements then combine to give an overall risk. If the risk is unacceptable, you might move to risk management measures, where options are considered. If it's on a trade pathway that might present a route for entry, there could be consultation with your trade partners. What are the phytosanitary measures you could introduce to lessen the risk? Then once measures are in place, monitoring and reviewing those measures, you can see how, if you've succeeded in reducing the risk to an acceptable level. If the risk isn't reduced sufficiently, then you go round the circle again and you can re-examine the assessment. So it can be a cyclical process. Next slide, please. So the complexity of pest risk analyses can vary as appropriate to the circumstances, I think is the phrase used in the SPS. So a very rapid pest risk analysis might be needed when there's an urgent, rapid decision is needed, when there's an interception of a new pest, for example, at the border, or if there's a new outbreak has been detected. In such circumstances, there could be a rapid qualitative evaluation of literature and online data sets and other evidence that you have to hand. When you have more time, perhaps in examining new trade pathways, and there's a risk from plants in trade, then you will take more time and evaluate more carefully doing a comprehensive risk analysis, again using scientific literature, online data sets, and you might have quantitative aspects that are contributing to the assessment and management of risk. And then the most detailed risk analyses might not actually be complete risk analyses. You might focus on particular elements of a risk analysis, be it entry or establishment or impact or management, all the different components of risk. And you can go into quite a lot of detail here, perhaps, to defend a country's phytosanitary measures if they're brought into dispute at WTO. Now, some of the methods in the box in the bottom right there, modeling and mapping, careful analysis of interception data, climatic suitability, and cost-benefit analyses, these could also be used in the more comprehensive PRA described above. It's rather loose, the types of methods you can use between a comprehensive PRA and those that you're using when you're defending yourself at WTO. Next slide, please. So the types of tools and resources that you need in the entry step, it's very often necessary to have trade data. Customs data is very useful, and certainly fruits and vegetables are detailed very well with different customs codes. Unfortunately, plants for planting, that is, plants with growing roots, for example, they're not very well described in customs code. They're not detailed at species level, which is often what you need when you're examining organisms that are only found on specific species of plants. In terms of establishment, there's quite good gridded climate data stemming from our interests in climate change. And there's good data forecasting different models for future climate scenarios, which is all useful for establishing where organisms might be, where the environment might be suitable for them to establish. What is lacking very often is detailed knowledge of the distribution of pests. You might have knowledge of which countries they occur in, but you really need, for more detailed PRAs, information on what are the limits, what are the constraints to the occurrence of an organism within countries. And then you can use such information to determine where it might be able to establish in other parts of the world. Regarding spread, there's different mechanisms of spread. An organism might be mobile itself, it might be able to spread naturally, but then there's also pathways of spread via trade and with other means of an organism being distributed once it's established in an area. And there's various different models that can be examined there, each requiring different types of inputs into the models. ISPM 11, that's the international standard for pest risk analysis of quarantine pests, refer to economic analyses that can be used to evaluate impacts. It refers to partial budgeting and partial equilibrium analysis. Very often, risk analyses in the phytosanitary arena are conducted by biologists. And if you're getting into this level of detail, you will really benefit from working with economists to examine these types of models and how they might help you. Next slide, please. So a couple of case studies now. So one, Thrips palmi. This is a picture of the organism bottom left. This is a polyphagous, so this is a pest that eats different types of plants, feeds on the leaves, flowers, and fruit of many horticultural plants in the families Cucurbitaceae, Solanaceae, and Orchidaceae. So these are things like cucumbers and melons and aubergines or eggplants. The organism originally is from Southeast Asia. The map in the center of the slide shows the countries where it is now found in orange and parts of countries where it occurs. And you know it doesn't occur in Europe. And next slide, please. Prior to 1995, this organism, Thrips palmi, had never been found in Europe. And then in the mid-1990s, there began to be interceptions of it. And the interceptions increased. And in 1997, we examined the different pathways and identified that the most common finding of thrips palmi were on orchids from Thailand coming into the EU. A risk assessment showed that although it was a tropical and subtropical pest, although it might not survive outdoors, it could very well establish in glasshouses, where cucumbers, aubergines, eggplants, and peppers could be fed on. These are crops at risk from the thrips palmi. So there was consultation with the Thai Ministry of Agriculture. This is the risk communication aspect with them. We worked collaboratively with them to develop enhanced phytosanitary measures, such that there would be inspections of productions of orchid cut flowers in Thailand by Thai inspectors looking for thrips palmi, and sites, if they were able to be certified free from thrips palmi, then the orchids would be exported. If they couldn't say that the sites of production were free from the insect, then they would have to apply chemical treatments, thripicides, that would kill the thrips. And such measures allowed trade to continue. Next. So here you see the darker green bars on the right-hand side is the effect, essentially, that the phytosanitary measures had in dramatically reducing the number of thrips palmi that were intercepted subsequently. I draw your attention to the black dark lines at the top, and these relate to the vertical axis on the right-hand side about the amount of imports of orchids from Thailand. So in the mid-1990s, as interceptions were going up, the volume of trade was going down slightly. People didn't want to buy their Thai orchids because of the thrips palmi. But very rapidly, after the measures were in place, you see that the black line increased and trade recovered very quickly, actually exceeding the volume of exports originally, before the thrips palmi had been found even. Next slide. Another example of a case study is a pathogen, a bacterial pathogen on watermelons, something called Acidovorax citrulli. So the map of the world, the green and yellow areas shows where watermelons are grown, and the ovals, the ellipses on the map are showing the areas of the world where the disease occurs. And you notice that in the Middle East and in Europe, where there's watermelon production, the disease isn't present there. And we were worried that the pest could be introduced, the pathogen could be introduced into Europe. And we conducted a risk assessment. It could be carried, it could arrive into this area in seed or seedlings, carrying the pathogen. And it would establish in warm and humid environments. Potential measures to inhibit the introduction would be seed testing and inspecting seedlings when they arrive. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit of a complicated slide, but we developed this risk analysis was conducted during a research project. And it used something called the Bayesian Belief Network, or BBN, to take into account the degree of belief that assessors had in their responses to different questions. The responses were sort of rated very low, low, medium, high, very high to different questions that could be asked. So there were 6 questions about the likelihood of entry of the disease, 1 question about if it would establish, 1 on the extent of spread, and 2 questions about the impact or the consequences of the organism establishing. And each of those, as I say, could be answered with a very low, low, medium, high, very high. And the assessors would assign their degree of belief across those different categories. So you didn't have to choose one simple category. If you thought it was 50% likelihood to be very low and 50% likelihood to be low, then you could assign your choices accordingly. Then the risk elements are combined in something called a conditional probability table, which is part of the Bayesian belief network. So the results are illustrated in the diagrams below. And essentially in the red box, we see at the bottom, the box 3.06 is an overall assessment of risk without measures. And that is influenced by the entry on the pathway via seeds and seedlings. They combine to give an overall likelihood of entry and then a potential impact. 3.05 in the red box combined to give pest risk. Now, if we look closely in the red box on entry pathway 1, we see that the black bars are essentially representing the degree of belief of the assessors, and that's fairly central. They've selected us a middle likelihood of seed being at the pathway. Now, in the box on the right, with measures in place, we can note that the degree of belief is shifted slightly to the left. So with measures, then entry on seeds is less likely. It might be more easily seen on the next slide, where we compare the overall risks. Next slide, please. So here, the top chart with the gray bars is the assessment without risk reduction options, without phytosanitary measures in place. And you see it's basically mainly a medium to high risk. Is a very low level that it's very low, and a small likelihood that it's very high. If we just move forward a few more clicks, please. And again, yep. So here, the graph on the top right shows the lines, which are the same you see on the graphs on the left-hand side. And essentially, you're trying to lower a lower risk would be moving the lines to the bottom left-hand corner of the chart. So the gray line is the risk without risk reduction options in place, and the darker dotted line is with risk reductions options in place. And because it's slightly lower, that it reflects the judgment of the risk assessor's effectiveness of measures in place. So it was an experimental method. It was able to capture uncertainty. It indicated the effectiveness of the measures. And because we can see that the risk isn't actually reduced that much, it represents the fact that actually seed testing and visual inspection perhaps aren't as that very effective in detecting this pathogen. It was a challenge to get this method adopted more commonly, and it isn't used so much, but it was certainly a useful way to examine how uncertainty could be brought into risk assessments, we felt. Next slide, please. So there are certainly other challenges within the PRA process on all elements of it. I've already mentioned the difficulty with customs data in relation to plants for planting, the occurrence and you need detailed information about the distribution of a pest in the areas where it already occurs to be able to make a good prediction of where it might be able to establish in the PRA area. You might need a lot of data for modeling spread, certainly for impact. Working with economists can help. Quantifying ecosystem service impacts can be challenging where they're not monetized. How you combine elements of risk together can be challenging in qualitative and quantitative methods. We heard a lot about risk communication yesterday afternoon and this morning and in earlier sessions, so we'll skip on to the next slide, please. One of the major issues that I find challenging is this, what I call the disconnect challenge. So the information, when there is information available in scientific literature from experimental studies, very often that's performed maybe in over a few seasons or a couple of years, a field scale, maybe even in small plots that are only a few meters wide. So across the bottom here is the spatial scale at which studies are conducted and the time, duration of such studies. So most scientific studies are for a few years at most on a small field scale, so of this sort of green blob in the bottom left-hand corner. And risk assessors are taking information over those time scales and those spatial scales to actually anticipate what might happen over much broader areas, whole countries or regions over a much longer time scale. And the data just doesn't overlap. So we're having to take information from a short time frame over in a small area and apply it over a bigger area over a much longer time scale, which is certainly a challenge. Next slide, please. And then the pest risk analysis process itself certainly has been criticized by some scientists. Pest risk analysis is reactive. You must know what the pest is. We're dealing with known knowns. We cannot assess risks, or it's very, very challenging. And you have to make comparisons with organisms that you do know about, but it's difficult to assess the risks from unknown organisms, that known unknowns. There's many examples where organisms only become pests when they're introduced into new areas, and they're not regarded as pests in the areas where they come from. This quote from Brokerhoff and Bullman in 2014, we have a good understanding of the risks posed by many known pests and pathogens, but experience indicates that there are many pests that are unknown. How do they behave when they encounter new environments that are different to their native range? Sometimes they're new species to science. And so there's been a call to actually think of new ways to assess risks. PRA focuses on genetically stable species. How do we take species that can adapt into account? Maybe they have wider environmental tolerances and can affect more hosts than they're exposed to in their native range. And then the challenge is in protecting plant resources, we're often dealing with one pest at a time. When you have multiple pests or multiple stressors, how do they combine? That's a challenge. Next slide. And that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that presentation. I'll now turn the floor over to Ms. Amy Philpott, who is a risk communicator with Watson Green LLC in the United States. She'll present on risk communication, a public-private partnership. As an accredited public relations professional with decades of experience, Ms. Philpott works with private companies throughout the food supply chain to engage in effective risk communication during food safety crises, as well as during non-crisis periods. Ms. Philpott, you have the floor. I think your microphone may be on mute.
Okay, well, that was a good rehearsal for the first slide.
Sure, it was excellent.
For those of you that don't lip read, greetings and good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. I want to thank the SPS committee organizers for inviting me to speak today. It is indeed a pleasure to be part of this panel of very distinguished speakers. As mentioned, I am a communication professional who works with food companies throughout the supply chain, both in crisis situations as well as everyday communications. And in that role, I have the opportunity to engage with the public sector on a regular basis regarding risk communication. What I'd like to do with the time that we have today is talk about what I mean when I say public-private partnership, because I'm sure there are folks in each sector that might be a little reticent about that term. I want to talk about why it's so important and then give some examples of how that partnership has worked. So when I refer to a public-private partnership. What I'm referring to is government and food industry operators and their organizations collaborating to use risk communication to protect public health. And there are many differences between these two sectors, between the public and private sector, not the least of which is their their communication strategies. So in the private sector, we typically use marketing communications with the intent to sell a product or a service. And of course, in the public sector, generally speaking, the strategy is to use science-based communications to provide information and reduce risk. On the outside, it may seem like these are two very different goals. But in actuality, when we look at those strategies much deeper, what we find is that when it comes to risk communication, I believe we are far more similar than we are different. For example, we have the shared goal and value of protecting public health. And while there may be some skeptics that say business is only out there for profit, I would counter with it's the same thing. You can't have a profit if you don't protect the people who generate that profit. So behind the strategy of selling is the goal of keeping customers and having them come back, which means you have to also protect their health and safety. So I believe this is a shared value and a shared goal. There are also some very practical benefits to working together. For example, the private sector can use and gain credibility by using the public sector's credibility, right? By aligning by aligning the private sector's priorities with government, we can actually gain credibility. Also, from the public sector side, as it's been pointed out before, the public sector requires the information that the private sector has regarding a particular risk and the access to targeted audiences. I'll give you an example. In a recall situation, it is the private sector that has the information about the product that we want to communicate to the public to reduce risk. The private sector also has access to the target audience through loyalty cards, through e-commerce records, and generally speaking, supply chain knowledge. So both parties come to the table with unique strengths that can help the collective better communicate risk. And finally, and very importantly, we both rely on consumer trust. And this has been mentioned before in several presentations, but it's so important that I want to focus on it just a bit more. Without trust, we simply cannot effectively communicate anything, let alone risk. Without trust, nothing else matters. Yes, there are other communication principles, honesty, transparency, authenticity, all of those have been mentioned, and they're all very important. But trust is the foundation of the social license that both public and private entities need to operate. So it's extremely important. The other thing about trust is that trust in one sector does affect trust in another. For example, if consumers don't trust the supply chain, the trust in the regulatory system that governs that supply chain will be threatened. And conversely, if they don't trust the regulatory system, then the trust in the supply chain is threatened. So they feed off of each other, and it's important for both sectors to realize that the trust in one can affect trust in the other. Trust has always been a component of effective communication, not just risk communication, but any communication. That's true. But today, trust is being distributed more through technology versus personal or in-person relationships as it was in the past. And in these digital platforms, trust is the new currency. Trust is paramount in these new distribution channels, these distribution channels that focus on technology instead of personal relationships. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about this because unfortunately, both the private and the public sectors are facing some challenges when it comes to being trusted. The Edelman Trust Barometer is an annual report that measures trust in government, business, media, and non-governmental organizations. It surveys 33,000 people across 27 countries. And for communicators, is kind of the go-to on trust in communications. Now, certainly taking any one report in 1 year doesn't show a trend. So I would encourage those who are interested to go online and look at the Edelman Trust Barometer over years so you can see trend line. What we're seeing and what the most recent report has shown is that trust in both sectors is declining. In the first half of 2020, of the 4 institutions that are included in the report, government was the most trusted. But by the end of 2020, that had changed and business was the most trusted institution. And there are a lot more details in the report that you'll find very interesting. And it breaks it down by country if you're interested in knowing where your country specifically fell. The news for private industry is not all that great, even though overall business was more trusted than government at the end of the year. When the researchers broke it down into the food and beverage sector, businesses actually dropped in terms of the level of trust. So by the end of 2020, people's trust in business, specifically in the food and beverage sector, had dropped nearly 12%. Now, we can say this was because of the pandemic and this is an anomaly, but I would warn that trust in one issue can affect overall trust, and that is for both private and public entities. So I think this decline in trust is concerning for all parties. So at the very best, trust is on shaky ground, but we know that we need trust in order to effectively communicate. And if we can't communicate risk effectively, we don't get credit for any of the things that we do to avoid, assess, or mitigate it. And that's the same for public or private entities. We can have the best mitigation efforts ever, and if we can't communicate it, we don't get credit for it. And if we don't get credit for the good things that we're doing, then how do we rebuild, build, and maintain trust? So I would propose that one way to do that is to work together. We're facing similar situations. We have a common value and a common goal of protecting public health. And we have many reasons, many benefits to work together. So let me give you an example of how this actually took place. Back in 2006, there was an E. coli outbreak associated with spinach, or eventually associated with spinach. In the early hours of the investigation, the attribution was unknown. And regulatory authorities in the United States were conducting extensive investigations to determine the attribution. And even after they determined attribution, there was a lot of course, investigation into how the contamination happened. During the entire period, the regulatory authorities were giving 2 briefings, originally daily, and then after a while, every other day, and eventually it dissipated. But when they were giving these 2 briefings, one was to the media and one was to the industry, both very important, equally important stakeholders to regulators. But they were giving the briefing to the media first. Immediately following was the briefing to industry. Now, both briefings contained the same information, but they were given separately and media was first. So what was happening is that while the industry was being briefed, and at the time I was working for an industry trade association, while we were being briefed, my phone was ringing off the hook from reporters asking questions about the briefing they had just received. The problem was I hadn't received that briefing yet, and so I couldn't answer their questions. There was a tremendous amount of frustration on the part of the media, but also the industry, because we couldn't answer those questions right away because we didn't have the information. After the situation, during the post-mortem, the suggestion was made to flip the briefing so that industry received theirs first, then the media, which gave industry about 45 minutes to an hour heads up so that we could prepare comments and answers to any questions that we might get. Just simply having that dialogue and switching the order of those briefings made a tremendous amount of difference in the risk communication that went out to the public. The media was able to get their questions answered from industry. Industry felt like they could be prepared and appear in a competent way to the media. And that translated to better communication with consumers. There are also many other examples, and I'll mention a few, but the main message here is it doesn't have to be complicated, right? Just acknowledging that one another as a partner is a big step in some cases, and that's on both parties, right? For private companies to see regulators or the government as partners in communication is a different spin, because we are accustomed to working with regulators on the enforcement side. We aren't accustomed to collaborating on the communication side. If you look at food safety plans or crisis communication plans, there will be a contact information, name and phone number and email for the enforcement contact at a regulator's agency, but not on the communication side. So I think just recognizing that we can partner in the risk communication field is an important acknowledgement. The fact that APEC, through its food safety risk communication framework, has actually inserted an industry annex says that there is a recognition that we are partners in this, and we need to work together when it's appropriate, right? Realizing we can't always work together, especially on perhaps the assessment and mitigation side, but certainly on the communication side, there is some room to partner. Engaging in advance of an issue is extremely important, because when an issue happens, it's oftentimes very difficult to establish the connections that you need to be able to work together. So doing that in advance is important. Doing that through third parties such as industry trade associations. I would encourage industry trade associations to include government in your meetings, reach out to them perhaps, and have conversations about risk communication. Again, industry associations invite the enforcement officials to conferences and meetings, but we don't hear from the risk communication professionals. And expanding that dialogue would benefit both. Also in this area of direct outreach, the Food Standards Australia and New Zealand has a committee called the Retail and Manufacturers Liaison Committee. And it is a committee to open dialogue about risk communication with the industry. What I find unique about this committee is that it is led by communication professionals, not enforcement professionals. And I think that makes it a little different than a lot of the interaction that these two entities engage in. I would also say that although I've never seen this before, I have often thought that when I'm crossing a border, whether it's a land border or you know, in an airport in customs and immigration, and you see videos usually with a cartoon, or maybe it's just text talking about sanitary and phytosanitary restrictions, and throw away your fruit, and don't bring cheese into the country, those sorts of things, animal products into the country. And I've often thought, would those messages be more effective if there were farmers delivering them? Videos of farmers saying why it's important to follow these sanitary and phytosanitary regulations because it protects the host country's agriculture. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to explore these joint risk communication goals in advance of an issue. As I said, during an issue, it's much more difficult. You really need those lines already established. I do want to call out, though, there has been a change, and this is a good example of engaging when an issue does occur. There has been a change in the last couple of years, how CDC in the United States engages with companies who are involved in an outbreak. And Laura mentioned a little earlier that they communicate with companies. And I would say in the last couple of years, what has changed is in that initial phone call from regulators, when a company is informed of either an actual link between their product and an outbreak, or a possible link between their product and an outbreak. CDC is now, as a health organization, is now part of that conversation, that initial call. And that hasn't always been the case. And just hearing the rationale and some of the factors that Laura pointed out in her presentation helps the company understand the risk better, but also communicate the risk better when they have to go out and communicate that, whether it be to consumers or customers or even employees. So those are just some examples of that private-public partnership and risk communication that has worked very well. And I know others in presentations have mentioned other examples. And I want to say that from the perspective of the companies that I've worked with, partnering with the public sector to communicate risk simply benefits everyone because it makes the communication better. And I would hope that we can continue to do that. So with that, I will thank you for listening. Thank you for your interest in this topic, and I look forward to answering questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy, for that presentation. Before we turn to questions, we'll go through the remaining speakers and then have a kind of a big question and answer session for all the speakers in this last session. So now we will hear from Ms. Yizu Wang and Dr. Fukong Wang, who are respectively Deputy Director and Section Chief at the Bureau of Animal and Plant Health Inspection and Quarantine within the Council of Agriculture in Chinese Taipei. Ms. Yizu Wang will first present on strengthening risk management measures for international mail articles of plant products, followed by Dr. Wang, who will discuss border control against African swine fever. Ms. Wang has worked in the plant quarantine aspect for 20 years. Her division at the Bureau of Animal and Plant Health Inspection and Quarantine handles inspection and quarantine for import and export of plants and plant products, as well as the establishment and revision of plant quarantine requirements and measures. Dr. Fukong Wang has about 20 years of experience in meat inspection, animal health inspection, and animal quarantine. He has recently been designated as OIE focal point for animal disease notification. So with that introduction, I'll hand the floor over to Ms. Wang. You have the floor. I'm not sure if your microphone is on mute, maybe.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Sorry. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Yizu Wang from Chinese Taipei. It's my honor to be here to share our policy of strengthening risk management measures for international mail articles of plant products. It will present from the risk identification, risk assessment, risk communication, and policy determination on risk management of international mails and parcels contained with regulated plant products. According to our regulations regarding the international mails, the postal articles are imported and exported postal mails and parcels delivered by the postal authority. In order to provide postal service, the state-run Zhonghua Post Company was established. It's different from cargo consignment. In most cases, there are no real taxpayers for international mails, and the recipients have no obligation to declare the goods to the customer. Therefore, many recipients have a folk mentality and want to encapsulate the plant regulated items by international mails. As we know, e-commerce delivered by international mails or parcels have become an important new trading pathway. From 2016 to 2018, the growing e-commerce market brought more international mails of plant regulated articles. We can see the yellow histogram. And non-compliance rate, the purple curve of these regulated plant articles also increased. That raised the challenges at the border in screening and preventing the entry of unauthorized goods, and increased the risk of introduction and spreading of pests into new territories. For example, we even found ants in the tubes sent with toys. And we also found the mini bugs from the plants through international mails. In order to reduce the import quarantine risk of those postal articles, we learned the practice from other members and amended the Plant Protection and Quarantine Act in 2018. In the act, it required that the implementation should be started from June 20th, 2019. while the detailed regulations entered into force. At the same time, in order to implement this new plant quarantine policy on international mails, during and after the amendment of the Act, we had internal discussion meetings on the draft practical regulations and procedures. In addition, we started the program designing on an online application and issuing a system for import permits. The system is also part of internal communication we just learned in today's morning section. It's aimed to help and reduce workload to a reasonable level for our staff. We also gather the individual recipients and companies, especially seed companies. The recipient briefings and stakeholder communications were held by our local branches for policy advocacy. The detailed regulation for quarantine of plant-regulated articles export and import by mail was published on May 30th, 2019, and entered into force on June 20th, 2019. That's the date required by the Act. It regulated that plant-regulated articles should not be sent by mail. If the articles still sent by international mails, they will be reshipped or destroyed directly. However, recipients who applied to the Plant Quarantine Authority for approval of entry in advance are accepted. We also encourage our people to notify the Plant Quarantine Authority immediately upon receiving international mails containing plant items, but without quarantine checking. If the recipients do not notify and was reported by any other person, the recipient will be fined 30,000 New Taiwan dollars to 150,000 New Taiwan dollars. For public awareness, we publish flyers in 8 different languages for the regulations in order to communicate and indicate the procedures of applying the import permits. They are including Chinese, English, Japanese, Thai, etc. Just like the flowchart, the recipients can apply for the permit online. We have the web for this application. The application will be distributed automatically to our local branches, and our staff can review the application online. Then to determine the approve or reject the application, and sending the permit to the applier, and the recipient can send the permit to sender. So when the board arrival into Chinese Taipei, we can check if the import permit is attached and the plant product is fully in compliance with general requirements, and the parcel will be released. If the parcel without import permit or not in compliance with general requirements, it will be directly destroyed or reshipped. And meanwhile, we also communicate with customers to strengthen the spot examination, especially by X-ray machine for international mails and parcels. After this new policy applied, we can see in the yellow part, the purple curves, the non-compliance rate of this plant item was decreasing from 45% in 2018 to 98% in 2020. And compare with the non-compliance rate of 6 months before and after the new policy in 2019, it decreased from 44% to 32%. It's the blue part. And let's look at the situation in 6-month intervals. The blue line is the new policy entered into force, is the date we implement the new policy. The males without import permit over total non-compliance males ranged from 33% to 50%. It means that there are almost half of males containing plant items were directly reshipped or destroyed. And they also means that there are still some recipients do not apply for the permit. We found that most of them are foreign workers or immigrants from Thailand, Indonesia, and China. In addition, the male with prohibited plant over total non-compliance, the rate did not decrease, which means that some recipients even try to conceal other prohibited or non-approval plant regulated articles. For other non-compliance, the rate, non-compliance rate of without final sanitary certificate or incorrect additional declaration is decreasing. That's because the recipients can realize the import plant quarantine requirements while receiving the permit. Therefore, they can inform the senders to prepare the mail, including applying for the PC to MPPO of exporting country and removing the soil before sending in order to avoid violation of the requirements. This new plant quarantine policy of permit system can reduce the biosecurity risk of unpredicted parcels and harmful pests being introduced through unapproved items. We developed an online application permit system with Chinese and English interface for submitting applications and issuing permits. Although the online system is easy and convenient, the new policy and procedures still add the acceptable workload to the staff. There are still some recipients do not apply for the permit or do not notify the senders to prepare the mail in accordance with the requirements stated on the permit, and even try to conceal other plants that are not proof. Therefore, more public awareness, education, and communication through social media, such as lazy bags or other creative materials, are highly needed. We need to continuously cooperate with the Immigration Department and the Ministry of Labor to strengthen publicity to foreign workers and immigrants, and also need to strengthening cross organization cooperation with customs and the post office. And we also dispatching quarantine detectors to assist in detection. The most important is that as the quarantine authority, BAFIC will keep reviewing and adjusting measures based on implementation status. This is my presentation today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wong. I'll now turn the floor over to your colleague, Dr. Fukong Wong, to give his presentation. Please go ahead.
Okay, can you see that?
We can see you, but not the presentation yet.
Oh, not yet. Okay, just a moment. Is it okay?
Yes,
see my
yes, your presentation is now visible.
Okay. Okay. Hello. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Fu Quan Ran. Today, I would like to thank you for your participating this webinar and give me this opportunity to share the risk and analysis about the border control against the African swine fever. In this session, I would like to brief the picture of risk analysis in the border control against the African swine fever in our custom territory. Because risk analysis is the topic of this speaking, I would like to introduce the main points of the relation link among the risk assessment, risk communication, and the risk management. The three components are interlinked to design the African swine fever prevention and control program, especially the border control of our customs territory for African swine fever. As we know, the African swine fever or other disease control measures might be modified for the dynamic change of situation or environment. The risk analysis should be reviewed frequently to achieve the goal, such as African swine fever prevention and control. Next. Okay, let's see. Let's see the background of the African swine fever. At first, I shall remind you that our custom territory is free from African swine fever till now. By the OIE African swine fever situation map, Asian is almost invaded these years. In 2005, there are few countries affected with African swine fever. The African swine fever cases was confined only in Africa and the Southern Europe. However, in 15 years, the African swine fever has spread to the Europe and also the Asia, especially the African swine fever cases budding quickly in Eastern and Southern Eastern and Southern Asia since 2018. Let's see the right table. Since 2005 to 2021, in Africa, 31 OIE members has reported ASF outbreak present and 21 for Europe, 14 for Asia, and 1 for Oceania. Only a few territories are free of ASF cases in Southern Asia. Okay, this is, as we know, the contact of human or animals might be an important factor for the African swine fever virus spreading. The geographics should be taken into account. Let's see the map. Our custom territory is near the African swine fever epidemics area closely, so our risk assessment are focused on the man-made factors and the risk pathway as the next two slides. In 2018, we have a program on the risk assessment on African swine fever. For the man-made factors, airports and the seaports are considered as the main gates of African swine fever virus in our custom territory. There are five kinds of risk factors that are considered. Pig farm workers, pork products are being considered as the high risk in their stability and the poverty. And the kitchen waste live pig salmon are considered as a moderate risk, and the ticks are low risk. I think it's different from any other area, but in our custom territory, the risk is just like this. Okay, let's see the next. This we also evaluated the risk pathway of African swine fever invention. The risk pathway are including the inbound passengers, imported goods, smuggling, swale, meaning 3-link, and draft garbage. Regarding the inbound passenger, some may carry meat products, some may have a job in raising pigs in infected area, and someone may be recorded for having brought meat products to our customs territory before. So they are all the risks. About the imported goods are always by the airplane, ship, couriers, and the post. Those meat products from infected areas is what we're concerned about. Smuggling is also an important pathway for many kinds of animal disease, such as FMD, foot-mouth disease. This is the same as for the African swine fever, and the swale, meaning 3-link, drift pig. But these drift pig bodies are also this pathway for our concern. Because of this communication should be performed around the whole chain of African swine fever prevention and control, I would like to share the risk management first in this slide. For prevention and control measure of African swine fever, they include the inspection in cargo, courier, and the post. We use X-ray inspection, and then we have a control measure of ship and the aircraft in order to cease smuggling and the food waste, and we also have a food waste management. And then the enhanced control for inbound passage. We do the enhance the passenger awareness and the African swine fever test for confiscated meat. And also we have control high-risk passengers and the crackdown in eligible meat products. The measures are under instruction and monitored by the command team for fighting African swine fever. The team has a routine discussion of current message of new events, statistical communication, etc. by PDCA tools to facilitate the effective of the measure. As the command team for the fighting African swine fever being mentioned, it is the core center for risk communication, not only to communicate with the Central Emergency Operation Center, but also the international communication and to operate cross-department cooperation and the PPP. PPP means a public and private partnership. And also they have to conduct public communication. About the Central Emergency Operations Center, it is our top center for strategy and policy on animal health and other critical disaster events. The command team must be in accordance with the central government center's strategy and the policy, and report their executive results of measures to the centers. About the international communication, we are also aggressive to join OIE relative activities regarding the African swine fever issues to get more technical information and monitoring the African swine fever situation around the world by the OIE-wise. In the cross-department cooperation and the PPP, we have cooperated with immigration and education, tourism, custom, and the police, Coast Guard administration, and the local government to achieve the measures. So another thing, we also established PPP to cooperate with farmer, retailers, sellers, food establishment, and the e-commerce, and the consumer, even the non-government organization to assist to fight African swine fever. For the public communication, we have a good experience with the airline and the ferry company to build awareness with their staff and the guests, such as travelers, keeping away from the African swine fever. And there are also traditional broadcasting, and just like a TV or broadcast, and using other media, just like Facebook Live and YouTube. This is all my briefing. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wong, for that presentation. I'll now like to continue on with the case studies, and I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Lillian DeLuna to speak about registration of pesticides in Canada under the Joint Review Program. Dr. DeLuna is section head at the Registration Directorate in Health Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency. She has worked in pesticide regulation for 18 years in various capacities and leads the team that coordinates and manages the review of pre-market pesticide applications, including joint reviews. Dr. DeLuna, I'll now give you the floor. I'm not sure, your microphone might be on mute as well. Yeah, I think it is, the microphone is still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry for that. All right. Good morning. Bon après-midi. Buenas noches. Thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak today. I have learned so much from the many excellent presentations on risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication from various perspectives. And at this point, I would like to touch on how risk is assessed, managed, and communicated in the joint review of pesticides. So pesticides are regulated in Canada at 3 levels, federal, provincial, and municipal levels. And the authority to regulate pesticides come from the Pest Control Products Act. And Health Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency is the body that is tasked with the federal regulation of pesticides. The PMRA conducts pre-market assessments as well as post-market assessments of pesticides. The diagram in this slide shows the life cycle of pesticide registration in Canada. It starts with a pre-submission consultation. which is a free service provided by the PMRA that potential registrants can take advantage of, where they will receive advice regarding required data or information for the proposed pesticide uses. It is a required step in the joint review for pesticides. Submissions are submitted electronically to PMRA. They are loaded into our database and screened for completeness in terms of data and non-data elements. The application then proceeds to the review stage, where the pesticide use pattern is established through the value assessment which looks into the efficacy of the pesticide as well as its benefits. This use pattern is then used as a basis for the human health and environmental risk assessment. The findings of the science team are then presented to senior management for a final decision. Once the pesticide is registered, it is renewable every 5 years, and it is reevaluated every 15 years. So what is a joint review? So pesticides can be registered in Canada through the regular process or through the joint review, which is a formal process that involves 2 or more countries. The timelines are negotiated in advance. The work is split among the participating countries, and data evaluations are exchanged and peer-reviewed by the different jurisdictions. And these are used as the basis for the independent risk assessment and regulatory decision. So just a little note about how joint reviews or the joint review program developed in Canada. It started as a NAFTA joint review, working closely with the US Environmental Protection Agency. And because of that work, this paved the way for global joint reviews. And in 2007, the first global joint review submission was received and involved Canada, the United States, Ireland, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. So what are the eligibility criteria for joint reviews? First, in order to be eligible, the pesticide active ingredient must be new to all participating jurisdictions. The active and the pesticide products are to be marketed in many countries. The timeline for dossier submission and uses must be similar in all countries, and at least one product should be common to all participating jurisdictions. If any products contain a combination of actives, those other actives must already be registered for those uses in the participating countries. I would like to note at this point as well that the same data or dossier should be submitted to all countries. So the joint review process, as I said, starts with the pre-submission consultation, and I will speak about the details of the process in the succeeding slides. So the joint review process begins with a request from industry about a joint review for pesticide registration, and it is the manufacturer or pesticide manufacturer who contacts the international regulatory jurisdictions that they want to be involved in the joint review. A pre-submission consultation is arranged early in the process, at least 2 years before the dossiers are submitted. And this slide gives a little bit more information of what information is required for the pre-submission consultation. The reasons why proposed product is a suitable candidate for the joint review process, what are the benefits, the anticipated date of dossier submission for the joint review, the proposed uses, the pesticide label. And there could be a separate technical meeting to address any science questions from the registrant and any formatting issues. In the planning stage, the project plan is developed and approved, and the project plan contains information such as who will be leading the joint review and who will be doing certain reviews according to the work split. For example, who will be leading the review, for example, for toxicology or exposure. The timelines, as I indicated, are negotiated and will include key milestones and dates as well as deliverables. In the review stage, it starts with a completeness check. There is a preliminary review of the data package and confirmation of individual study review responsibilities. This is very important because it contributes to the success and the efficiency of the joint review process. The review stage also includes the primary review, which is a detailed information of the data and information provided by the registrant, and it is conducted to establish the hazard of the pesticide, for example, toxicology endpoints or residues of concern. Once this is addressed in the primary reviews, it is peer-reviewed in the process called secondary review by the other countries to allow participants to establish a similar hazard. And an example of this is an agreement on the tox endpoints. Throughout this process, participating countries communicate to discuss issues and track progress. Once the toxicity or hazard is established, the different jurisdictions conduct their own independent risk assessment based on the country's specific use pattern, risk assessment policies and procedure, transparency requirements, among other things. The recommendations from the science team are then presented to senior management, and each country makes their own independent decisions. The discussions at the senior management level include considerations on how to manage risks from pesticide use. Each country then communicates the decision through a proposed decision document, which gives information about the pesticide, its mode of action, the approved uses and directions for use, as well as the results of the human health and environmental risk assessment. A consultation step follows, and comments from stakeholders are addressed and is followed by the publication of the final registration decision. The pesticide label is also finalized by including risk mitigation measures arising from the pesticide risk assessments. Examples of risk mitigation include use of personal protective equipment when using the pesticide and required buffer zones to protect non-target organisms. There are many benefits of joint reviews, but in the context of this workshop, the most relevant benefit is establishing harmonized maximum residue limits for pesticides, which help reduce agricultural trade barriers. The joint review process makes it possible for countries to have access to the same products at the same time and provides an opportunity to strengthen the regulatory process. While working together on joint reviews has many benefits, there are challenges as well. Various countries have different legislation requirements and policies, and this affects what is agreed upon in the project plan. For example, the date of final registration decision is established through legislation in some countries, but is established by policy in others. The size and complexity of the dossier can be a source of pressure for the reviewers and may affect their ability to deliver on the agreed upon timelines. Some years ago, joint reviews would involve applications to register an active ingredient and 2 to 3 end-use products. Now, it can involve 6 or more end-use products, as well as products containing more than 1 active ingredient. So this impacts resource needs and timelines. It's also important to point out that communication can present some issues as well. It can include issues with logistics, such as arranging meetings, considering the time difference, or time differences between the participating countries, or it can be an issue with timeliness of communication among partners. Certainly, part of these challenges is managing expectations and dealing with delays. As all of us know, it can be challenging to resolve issues that arise in a timely manner, and that includes joint reviews. Moving forward, efforts are being made to improve communication between and among participating countries. This includes making sure that counterparts are invited to meetings held in each participating country where risk assessment approaches and conclusions are discussed during the primary review stage, as well as the independent risk assessment stage. For example, PMRA is usually invited to attend residue and talks meetings by the other participating jurisdictions. With respect to the joint review process itself, PMRA is working with its international partners in streamlining the joint review process. For example, more recent joint reviews we are conducting for the more recent joint reviews that are being conducted, where the formal primary and secondary reviews are done only for the dietary risk assessment. And for the other streams, countries conduct their own reviews. And while the participating countries regularly communicate and share information, they do not formally complete secondary review. So there is some flexibility in the process, and we are taking steps to ensure that we examine the lessons learned to inform how we can improve the joint review process for the registration of pesticides. That ends my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lillian, for that presentation. I'll now turn to our last speaker in this workshop, Ms. Barbara Galani, who will present on International Initiative on Trust. Ms. Galani is the head of Communication and Engagement and Cooperation Department within the European Food Safety Authority. Ms. Galani has extensive experience communicating complex issues in the area of food safety, authenticity, and research to lay audiences and managing incidents of food scares. With that, I'll pass you the floor. Please go ahead.
Many thanks, and I can just echo what Lillian De Luna said just before me, which it's been a really, really interesting session with a lot of learnings, and I hope I can contribute with our experience to some of your thinking, especially on trust. Trust was mentioned by many colleagues before me yesterday and today, and trust is a prerequisite for good risk communication. Now, the chief scientist of the UK government a few years ago said something that I found quite inspiring, which is science is not finished until it is communicated. And I think we can take this further and say that science is useless without trust, because we can communicate about science, but if there isn't trust in the institutions and in the outcomes of the science is not going to be used, is not going to be at all useful. And I think post-COVID, we've all experienced this friction between what makes trusted science and what makes science untrusted. So I will talk during this presentation about a very positive experience that we've had working internationally. And unfortunately,
Hi, Barbara,
I can't move my...
It's Greg. Sorry to interrupt. There appears to be some background noise in your presentation. I don't know.
Yeah, I apologize about this. Sorry. Okay, I'll try and keep my voice as high as possible. I hope this is better. I'm having a technical problem. I can't change my slides. So I don't know if I can maybe just come out. Just give me a second to try and resolve it.
Okay, thank you.
I hope you can see my second slide.
We can see the slides. If you do need help moving them, we can upload them here.
Okay, but let's
help
try it. So I want to talk about a very specific initiative that we did with the US EPA. It was a very good opportunity for cooperation between a national body and a regional body, tackling the issues of trust and communication and engagement with very similar challenges. So we decided together to initiate an international over 3 years. We started last year with a webinar and continued this year with a virtual poster session. And next year, we will have a trust workshop in a hybrid form. And the Edelman Trust Barometer has already been mentioned by Amy in her presentation. It's really looking at what we can understand about the social construct of trust and how we can apply it to developing communications that are targeted to specific audiences in the area of food safety. Now, oh dear, I'm having the same problem with the slide. Give me one moment. Okay, I'm back on track. So the event last year covered a presentation on the layers of trust, the difference between general trust, interpersonal trust, and social trust. And it's important to understand them in order to develop communication and engagement strategies that are really focused impact that we want to achieve, rather than what we want to push and communicate. We also touched on the difference between trust and confidence, and this is informing a campaign that we run this year. And the trust and confidence concepts are also helpful in shaping different messages. The shared values is the third and very important aspect, which is linked to the trustworthiness of organizations. There were questions in the Q&A earlier about what can we do if we know that risk communication messages from government organizations are not trusted. And the answer is probably in the investment, as previous speakers were saying, on listening, and the investment on openness, transparency, and communication about values. Values that need to be shared in order to really foster this trustworthiness element. Okay, next slide, 1 second. Okay, so this is the participants list to the event that we just did last month. And you see that the interest shown across the globe reflects the fact that the challenges by different national authorities, regional and international organizations are very similar. And what we tried and capture in our effort was really the transferable learnings from campaigns, from activities, from interactions with media and citizens, so that we can build internationally on the experience that we've got, and develop maybe even frameworks or toolkits that can be used in an environment around food safety that is more and more global. And Natasha or Anastasia from the Commission was really talking about the importance of coordination. And now you will be pleased to know it's my last slide coming, so I won't be struggling with moving forward for much longer. But you see that in the poster sessions, what was covered was everything from the general principles about constructing trust in regulatory science from our German colleagues, and some general principles about awareness of food safety issues, to some very specific interventions that can be transferable because of the principles behind them. So you see stakeholder engagement in the development of dietary exposure assessment tools, communication on allergens. We've done ourselves a lot of work on communication about African swine fever, which I've seen reflected in many of the presentations that we had today. Really interesting learning experience for me. And we tried to involve also other sectors. You see the European Environment Agency, the European Medicines Agency, because through cross-sectoral exchanges, we can also learn. And this is something that can be very enriching for a community that is trying to deal with the same issues. I'll stop here. I'll try and come out of my presentation, and I'm ready to answer questions and to participate in the debate that will follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So now I'll turn to the question and answer section of the session right now. Perhaps I'll start with a general one that came through the chat, and I think it has come up across a number of presentations in terms of information sharing from government, and I believe I think it was Amy's presentation talked about information going to the media first or to industry first, and how trust can be built. How can governments and stakeholders work together to build trust in terms of information sharing? I don't know if who would like to jump in to try to tackle that question first. Please feel free just to jump in or wave your hand. I'll see how we can manage this.
I'll jump in first. Regarding the question of internal trust or trust among stakeholders, it's absolutely essential. And I believe the question that was asked or brought up was that perhaps there was a lack of trust between the public and private sector, and that's why the media was notified first. In that particular case, that was not the impression that I got in the debriefing. I think it was more that the regulators wanted to get the information out to the media first because the thought was it would get out to the consumers first. But what was happening instead is that the media was waiting to hear from industry. That might not be the case today because we live in a different media world. It operates faster. Even in 2006, it was much slower than it is today. But I think the fundamental answer to the question is that mutual trust is a must between stakeholders. And that doesn't just occur between public and private and consumers, but also within the public-private relationship. And that has to be built and fostered as well. It wasn't the focus of this presentation today, but I agree completely that it is necessary.
Thank you, Amy. I see Barbara has her hand up, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I think for me, this question raises also something else that I find myself discussing with colleagues operating in the same field, which is what when trust, mutual trust, doesn't seem possible because of different roles in society, because of past experiences, because of activism. And at what point is it necessary to stop investing in building trust? And I think for me, from my experience, is that this opportunities to build trust never cease. And even when there are very polarized views, there are always ways to keep the dialogue open. So I thought that I might share this and see if others on the panel had similar experiences.
Thank you for that. I see Lillian ready to jump in.
Thank you. I'd just like to speak about the trust sharing of information in the context of joint review of pesticides. In this process, it is very clear in the with the participating jurisdictions that there is sharing of information. There's common data that is submitted to all the participating countries. And so trust between the participating reviewers from the different countries are shown or demonstrated in respect of the primary reviews, which is done by one country and then peer reviewed by another. But aside from the aspect with respect to the science reviews, there's also the trust from stakeholders and the public that the review of the pesticide is a collaborative, cooperative effort among different international partners. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Ms. Wong now.
Thank you. Yes, I think the trust is a long way to build and easy to destroy it very easily, immediately. And I think the trust is built on transparency enough and more communication by the stakeholders with a government with the stakeholders. So I think that we should provide our information as transparency as possible to gather the trust from the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think I see Alan's hand up. Yeah, so please, Alan, go ahead.
It's more of a just reference back to this morning and what Marcus Lipp was saying about being honest. If we're honest in our communication, that's, I would imagine, the best way to ensure trust.
Indeed. I'll ask another general question here, and one that came up in the chat is importing countries and exporting countries, and their observation was that there are different, the views are different, and so are the stances are different in terms of risk and risk communication. Amongst the panel here, how can the gaps be narrowed in how you look at it from an import versus export perspective? I don't know if anyone wants to try to tackle that one. Alan, please go ahead.
Well, I guess if we're talking about trade, really, this is where the economists come into play, isn't it? I mean, importers have something to gain because they want something from the exporters, and the exporters get revenue, obviously. I'm a scientist. I do risk assessment and risk analysis, but there must be common ground, and you know, that's struck, and that's maybe a little bit outside of the science of risk analysis, really. Yeah, so I don't really have a great answer though, but there must be interests on both parts, and we want to maximize the benefits on both sides.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see Barbara wanting to jump in on that.
Yeah, I think I agree with Alan. It's a bit difficult to answer this as a risk assessor, because as a risk assessor, we look at risks. We often think of risks as without boundaries, and we are very, very interested in the coordination and communication that can assist our science to really remove risk. And importers can become exporters and the other way around. And I work for the European Food Safety Authority. There are 20 27 countries that all have different trade interests and slightly different production sort of focuses. So this is not something that is at the forefront of our sort of focus when we develop communications. Thanks.
Thank you, and I'll give the floor to Ms. Wong.
Yes, indeed, the consideration of import country and export country is quite different. I think it's possible to expand the risk communication. It's also need to have communication more between two parties. So more communication, more cooperation is enhance the pest risk assessment and other management measures decision. So it's quite different case by cases and countries by countries. So such as we Chinese Taipei have a lot of application for the importing market access and from different countries. So we have need to have more discussion with the counterpart, and that's we think is just like a part of risk communication, because it's not for the stakeholders, but it's for your counterpart. So it can be included the thinking way to have to communicate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see, Amy, you have your hand up. Please jump in.
I just wanted to comment from the private sector's point of view. In terms of risk communication, it's important that we communicate that the risk isn't inherent in that a product is either imported or grown domestically, that the origin of the product is not part of the inherent risk. And that is a challenge that we face to varying degrees when we communicate risk, but nonetheless, very important.
Thank you. Another question in the chat that talks about the communication culture in different countries or different regions of the world, and is there a need and how to reconcile intercultural communication skills in communicating risk? Has anyone come across that, and how that can be addressed? I know it kind of maybe builds on some of the import-export questions and we just discussed, but is this an important area in terms of risk communication when we're looking at and I see Barbara.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think we're doing some work specifically on the communication of risk versus hazards in the European context. And the research is prompted by the fact that in different languages and in different cultures, these concepts are explained in very different ways. In some languages, risk and hazards haven't got a different term to express them. So I think this demonstrates that the cultural element in the risk communication always needs to be considered. It's not just a question of language, it's a question of localization of materials, it's a question of using visuals that resonate with people and really attract their attention in the way that is intended by the campaign or the communication. So very important, unfortunately very costly and resource intensive, but something that needs to be done.
Thank you very much. Alan, please go ahead, and then Lillian, please jump in after Alan.
Yeah, I agree with what Barbara was saying, how it's very important. In the IPPC guide to risk communication, when you're identifying your target audiences, you have to take cultural aspects into account. How do they, what are the communication channels that they trust, and make sure you cover them appropriately. So it can be a challenge, but certainly it's something to bear in mind if you want to do a good job in risk communication.
Thanks. And Lillian, please go ahead.
I just wanted to echo what Alan and Barbara had talked about. And from the pesticide registration perspective, it is very important to use a really efficient way of communicating risk as well. And from a pesticide registration perspective, this is through the documents, the regulatory documents that result from the risk assessment that was done. So it is very important to characterize that risk and talk about the hazard, the hazard information that was considered, the actual risk assessment that considers exposure, what the label amendments and risk mitigation measures are that resulted from the risk assessment, and of course the format itself of the registration document, as well as the opportunity for the stakeholders to comment during the consultation period. And then these comments are then addressed before a final registration decision is made. I need to make a point as well with regards to making information on registration decisions available in the two official languages of Canada so that it reaches a wider audience, and those that would like to make comments are then provided a format and a way that they can do so very easily. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lillian. I'm going to go back to the question and answer box here, and I see another question, and it talks about, it says, sometimes surveys measuring declared risk, perception and appreciation are very limited in scope, and they don't necessarily reflect how consumers and citizens react in real life. And they say, how can we progress on this to gain a better picture of overall preparedness for upfront food crises? So I don't know who wants to try to tackle that one first. I'll let you jump in. And I see Barbara.
Thank you. As Natasha said in her presentation earlier, we've just published 4 reports on the science of risk communication. And one of the gaps in knowledge is really about behaviors and how interventions affect behaviors and how we can't really map this direct or indirect link between declared behaviors and actual behaviors. So it's an area that deserves a lot more attention than is given at the moment. So I noted that question when I saw it in the Q&A, and I thought it was a really important one. But having said that, there is more investment now in social science research in support of risk assessment and risk analysis. And there are many different social science methodologies that can be used. We're using more and more focus groups, which get a little bit deeper than surveys into behavioral attitudes.
All right, I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that one. There is one question I see here in terms of private trust versus public trust, and what's the difference? What are we getting at between those two? Sorry, the question just fell off my screen. But if someone wants to take that on, I'll open the floor. And I see Amy commented on it as I was talking about it, so I'll let you go ahead as it disappeared off my screen.
I'll start. Trust for both sectors, I believe, is based on the foundation of honesty and transparency and authenticity and all of those factors that we've talked about. I do think there is a difference, though, in that the public sector is generally expected to be more objective, to not be influenced by market factors and the marketplace elements. Whereas I think the expectation on the private side is that we are influenced by market forces, and that probably gives the public sector a bit more credibility in that area.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I don't know if others want to jump in on this. If not, I'll go back to the question box here. There's some specific ones. One in terms of in the EU, so I don't know if Barbara, you want to tackle this, and it says, is risk analysis considered to be an item included in an internal audit process in the EU? And if so, are there standard operating procedures for risk analysis? I don't know if you want to try to address that specific question.
If there are standard operating procedures for risk analysis. Okay, yes. Oh gosh, I could go on forever. At EFSA, in terms of risk assessment, we have a very rich catalogue of agencies apply, and the guidances are approved by the member states. So they're developed by experts in our panels, then approved, and then they're used to really apply the risk assessment principles. And these guidance documents are freely available and are constantly under review based on the most recent evidence. So yes.
And I see Alan as well wants to jump in on this.
I would say that in the phytosanitary area, it's not so much a standard operating procedure as you're following guidelines. So you've got international standards. ISPM 2 is the framework for pest risk analysis, and ISPM 11 is the pest risk analysis for quarantine pests. And they give you the framework. And then countries often develop their own templates based on those international standards, and they often consist of questions that are responded to during an evaluation of a pest that presents a risk to plant resources. I wouldn't call them a standard operating procedure, though, because there's variations into the level of detail you go into in each assessment. It depends on the information that you have available, and there's lots of many other factors that make it more variable than like if you're conducting a chemical analysis where you have prescribed procedures and you follow an SOP. I don't think that's the case for phytosanitary risk analysis, though.
Thank you, Alan. I'll jump to another specific question, and it's to Ms. Wong, and they're asking what is the standard or approximate time for conducting risk assessments in Chinese Taipei for imported products from other countries? I don't know if you have a rough timeline or some guidelines you can provide on that.
Yes, it's hard to give any timeline for conducting the pest risk assessment. I think it's also hard to any members to determine what time can finalize the assessment, because it should depend on the pest status and the scientific evidence we can gather, or any unconfirmed information we need to declare to clarify. So I think it's hard to give to give a physical time period for any product of the pest risk assessment. Thank you.
Thank you. I see one question that just came in, and I'll open this to anyone. It's asking, in risk assessments, do you include socioeconomic impacts in undertaking these assessments? It's kind of an open question, but I'll give the floor to Lillian to kick it off on that.
With respect to pesticide reviews in Canada, the socioeconomic aspect is not part of the risk assessment per se, but it is considered in the value assessment. So the value assessment consists of two parts, which is the efficacy review. Does the pesticide work according to what is stated on the label? And the second part is, what are the benefits of using the pesticide? So in here, information such as socioeconomic impact, contribution to risk reduction, things like that are considered. So in the context of the whole pesticide review process, socioeconomic information is considered in the value assessment, not necessarily at the risk assessment stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll pass the floor now to Barbara.
Yeah, same as Lillian, this pretty much applies in the same way in Europe. So there are some agencies like the European Chemicals Agency who have in their remit the socioeconomic analysis. But the European Food Safety Authority has not got socioeconomic analysis as part of the risk assessment, but at the level of decisions, these aspects are considered. And something that is quite relevant to mention is that with the Farm to Fork strategy and a much bigger focus on sustainability, we're having a lot of discussion at political and technical level in Europe about how to include socioeconomic assessments already at the risk assessment stage.
Thank you. I don't know if others want to jump in on this, or if not, I can move perhaps to one last question to wrap up our session. And it's asking, what are the risk monitoring methods and frameworks? So a general question to wrap up. So if anyone wants to jump in on that, and I'll give the floor to Alan.
So there's a number of risk monitoring. I'm immediately thought of horizon scanning techniques. There's media monitoring that can be quite sophisticated, web-based scanning for news articles, for emerging hazards, emerging threats. The EPO, Regional Plant Protection Organization for Europe and Mediterranean area, they have monthly bulletins. They scan scientific literature and gather information from member states, and they share that in monthly newsletters with information about emerging risks, emerging pest threats, and so on. So there's multiple approaches that can be taken. There's a call at the moment, actually, for the FAO IPPC are trying to, part of their strategy, I think, is to have a global early warning system for plant pests. And certainly countries can or should be alerting the IPPC and notifying them of pest incursions and so on, and sharing information. This comes back to risk communication. So, you know, if countries know where pests are around the world, they can prepare accordingly.
Thank you, Alan. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that. Not seeing anyone. There are still some questions there, but I'm recognizing that we're near the end of our time here today. So perhaps I will now try to wrap up the whole 2-day session here, so we can end. So first of all, thank you to all the speakers in this afternoon's session for the informative presentations and replying to the questions in the Q&A chat. It was very informative, useful for me, and I'm sure useful for all the participants on the call. So thank you once again for your participation and your very good presentations today. Over the last 2 days, we have also heard many interesting presentations. Speakers have explored all concepts of risk, including risk assessment, management, and risk communication. The discussions yesterday highlighted very clearly the links between risk assessment and risk management activities and the need for risk assessors and risk managers to coordinate. The discussions yesterday also made clear that other actors have key roles to play in risk assessment and risk management activities. These include other government agencies, but also private sector actors and community groups and consumer groups, sorry. This again was highlighted in today's presentations, where we've heard from various speakers about strategies and experience to ensure that risk assessment, risk management options, and assumptions and uncertainty of risk assessment are clearly communicated to both internal and external audiences and stakeholders. The importance of forming trust, which was a recurring theme throughout the workshop, working with transparency, and developing confidence in regulatory decisions was at the heart of the many interventions we had today. Importantly, strategies to overcome challenges associated with institutional capacity and technical constraints have also been explored over the last 2 days. I'd also like to point out that this session did have a very generated a lot of interest. Looking at the number of registered attendees, we had over 1,000 attendees registered for this last 2-day session. We had great engagement in the formal presentations, the question and answer box, but also in the informal sessions that went over the lunch break here in Geneva, which had lots of rich discussions. For me, that shows that this session answered a need to have more in-depth discussion on risk and risk analysis. So with these remarks, and it did come up a few times, just to remind everybody that the event was recorded in all 3 languages, and the video recordings, as well as the presentations that were delivered, will be made available on the dedicated webpage for this event. And the web link, I believe, is being put up in the chat now. On this webpage, you'll also find information on all the speakers that presented or intervened in the workshop. You'll also find a catalog of useful resources pertaining to risk analysis, including resources from the WTO, Codex, IPPC, OIE, and other resources. These resources include relevant reference documents, guidance and tools in all aspects of risk analysis, as well as links to previous WTO events on risk, including training materials, presentation, and e-learning courses. I would again like to thank all the speakers and moderators over the last 2 days for their presentations and intervention in this workshop and making time for us to have this successful workshop. I do also want to extend my thanks to the interpreters who were with us the last 2 days to help interpret on this Zoom workshop. And of course, all the colleagues in the WTO Secretariat, from the video conferencing unit to the training division and the SPS team who are here, who really did a tremendous job in organizing speakers from around the world and coordinating this event, which I said again had over 1,000 delegates and members registered. So a great turnout. So before closing, I will draw everyone's attention to the evaluation form for this event, which the WTO Secretariat is requesting all attendees to complete. The link to this form has also been posted in the chat. So I'd ask you to please take a few minutes, if you have some, to complete this and submit this form. So with that, thank you everyone again for this workshop, and I wish you a good rest of your day or evening or morning, wherever it may be. Thank you again. The workshop is now closed.